discussions on international political issues for major networks such as CNN, Fox News, and NPR. And he's the author of numerous books on warfare and intelligence. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to George Friedman.
When I was last here, I discussed the European crisis. The European crisis has intensified and has been joined by a series of crises across the Eurasian landmass. And when I say Eurasia, I mean Europe and Asia, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Arctic Ocean to the Indian Ocean. And it's noteworthy that every significant part of that landmass, with the exception of India, is in fundamental systemic crisis. And we have not seen a model like this really since World War II. This does not mean that I'm saying that we're going to have a war or anything else. I'm simply saying that the pattern is ominous. It is not yet deep in the sense of intractable, but it is broad. And we need to understand why it's that way. Because the world has now taken an interesting shape. Eurasia is in chaos, or close to it, in Europe, in Russia, in China, in Central Asia, in the Middle East, certainly. While North America and the Western Hemisphere in general is stable, relatively stable, not perfectly stable. But the great contrast that is developing in the world is the massive distinction between the two hemispheres in the way, including Latin America, is behaving. And the massive distinction that particularly exists between North America, NAFTA, and the various trade zones and alliance blocs in the Eastern Hemisphere. This is a pattern that will not emerge and then go away in 3 years. It is a fundamental shift, and an understandable and predictable one I'll try to make, that really ushers in a new phase of human history. In the Middle East, you have had the collapse of the states that Europe invented. Syria was an invention, Lebanon was an invention, Jordan was an invention, Israel was an invention, Iraq was an invention. They all had origins of sorts, but many of them, particularly Syria and Iraq, no longer exist. They don't exist because at a certain point the United States decided it was not going to take responsibility, as the British might have, for the future of the region. Not necessarily a stupid decision, but one with consequences. For Iran, it is now in a very different game than it was. The United States has essentially taken its hands off the wheel. And there are 4 great powers in the region that can't leave: Israel, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a question mark. But let's say there's 4. The American strategy is to be not particularly friendly with anyone and not particularly hostile to anyone. So it is drawn a bit closer to the Iranians, a bit farther from the Israelis, deals with the Turks. This is called learning what the Romans did, learning what the British did, the balance of power. You don't send main force. The British never sent its entire military force into India. They played the various factions against each other and used local forces. And this is what you're seeing. At this point, the Iranian problem is Turkey, which is what the United States wants. The American problem is to make sure the Turks become more aggressive. The Turkish problem is, please do not draw me into your game. The American solution is, come to me, baby. So when we look at the situation for Iran, totally different from the Indian situation, we're seeing India drawn into the regional system precisely by getting what it wanted: the sanctions lifted. its greatest benefit was the sanctions because it kept them out of the game. Now they have no choice. They must be involved in Iraq. Iraq fundamentally affects them. They therefore are doing what the United States would like them to do. The Russians are doing what the Americans want them to do. The United States does not want Assad to fall now. Now. Later, yes. Earlier, yes. Now, no, because of ISIS. The United States could not save Assad for political reasons, domestic and foreign. The Russians come in, they save Assad, they leave the question of ISIS open for the United States to deal with to the extent it wants. And what the United States is doing very brilliantly, and I know we're not supposed to be smart, but it's unintentional, what the United States is doing very brilliantly is forcing all the other players to do what it wants, because we have learned a fundamental lesson. You do not maintain a global power by constantly rushing multi-divisional forces into a region. You get tired. You must learn the balance of power, and it's being learned. And the important thing is, I don't know if Obama knows he's doing it or not. You are pulled into this because you must, because you don't have other options. He doesn't have the option of sending forces. So Iran must be understood in terms of the new American game.
Anyone else? On the far side.
The fundamental problem of Europe is an attempt to take a country like Greece and a country like Germany and give them the same currency. Moreover, to leave in the hands of each individual country fiscal policy while a central bank controls monetary policy, so there's no coherence between the two, and have one country so overwhelmingly powerful, Germany, that it has the ability to set the regulations of Brussels and the behavior of the European Central Bank, not because it's a conspiracy, because if you don't support the German economy, then it all comes tumbling down. You don't have Europe. There is no such thing except as a geographical expression. The unemployment rate south of the Alps is over 20%, somewhere 25%. That is the same rate of unemployment the United States had during the Great Depression. The unemployment rate in Germany is 4.5%. The harmonization of these economies is not possible. And therefore, on virtually every other issue, they are unable to act. But behind all this is the great bubble, Germany. Germany exports 47% of its GDP. I'm not good at arithmetic, so give me 50%. Which means that every time it loses 5% in exports, it loses 2.5% in GDP. Now, losing 2.5% of your GDP matters. But if you lose 15% of your exports, you've lost 7.5%. The point I'm making is Germany is on the edge of the volcano. It is a massive exporting power that has built its economy on the assumption of expanding demand for its goods, basically in the European Free Trade Zone. And that can't happen now. Its entire structure is based on that because domestic consumption can only be raised so much when you have that much out there. Other countries are in this position, South Korea, for example. But only Germany is the fourth largest economy in the world. So the size of the imbalance relative to the global system is massive. Now, in a world in which you have an exporter's crisis, and one of the greatest exporters in the world, Germany, with a larger dependence on exports than China or any other country that you might name, the global exporter, if you will, from a percentage point of view. I think the Russians are going to be very aggressive, and I think the Russian Federation will go the way of the Soviet Union for the same reasons. High defense costs, low energy prices. That took down the Soviet Union. That will, I think, take down Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed, all nuclear weapons under American tutelage was transferred to the Soviet Union so that Kazakhstan wouldn't have a nuclear capability, which we all think is a good idea. If the Russian Federation collapses, what happens to those nuclear weapons? The frightening thing about Russia is that it is a nuclear power, and if it fragments, something has to be done about it. And there really isn't anything that can be done. What do you do?